This is the Geopolitics and Empire podcast, and we're speaking with Danny Haiphong, who is the co-author of American Exceptionalism and American Innocence. We'll be talking about this concept of American exceptionalism and how it is used by the U.S. empire, as well as American citizens, as a way to justify, some wrong actions carried out by the U.S. government. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Danny.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, before we discuss Danny's book, I would like to make a disclaimer that although our guest is, I'm not sure how you can tell us how you might identify as, leftist, progressive, or socialist. I am not. But what brings us together is that we both think there is a problem with American exceptionalism. And I hope, once again, that this is an example of how people from different views or ideologies can hold a respectable and constructive dialogue in trying to identify and help solve problems that plague our nation and the world. And so before we get into exceptionalism, Danny, could you care to comment on the importance of people from different sides being able to discuss issues and your experience in talking with people from different perspectives?
Yes. I consider myself, I've been writing for Black Agenda Report for about 5 years or so. And the book was really based upon a lot of the writing and work that we've done and the inspiration I've garnered from it. And, we're a journal of the Black left. And so, I'm Vietnamese myself, and I've taken a lot of cues from the Black liberation movement, which has been mostly a socialist movement. However, when it comes to this day and age, and I consider myself a socialist, but when it comes to this day and age that we're in, under the conditions that we're in the United States especially, we need to be able to have conversations with people who may think differently from us. Of course, this doesn't mean that we find it okay when certain right-wing or reactionary politics emerge in our movements and our struggles. But what it means is that we can appeal to broad sections of struggling people in the United States around questions that are so urgent, especially when it comes to this question of empire, which, has the potential, with the way that the United States behaves around the world, into creating a catastrophe of nuclear proportions with big powers like Russia and China, which has to be really investigated. And I think being able to talk about American exceptionalism like we do in our book really helps us do that, and really helps us to engage in these conversations in a way that even if you do not agree with the way I think about things in terms of my analysis, that you will understand that some of these questions require more than even just ideological precision and ideological agreement, but rather an understanding that we need to come together and ensure that the U.S. empire doesn't kill us all.
Now, exceptionalism for me, I don't think it's talked about too much, but, myself as an American, it's something that affects not just Americans, but the whole world. And it's a fascinating thing. For me, it's curious, it's enigmatic. And, from my view, I see it certain ways. And I think it's valuable to read books such as yours, where, you're coming from a different perspective, but maybe you talk about things that I don't see, that I miss. And I think exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, is criticized by people from the left, perhaps to a lesser extent from the right, but also other groups such as libertarians. And the U.S. government clearly uses this idea of exceptionalism to provide cover for itself as it launches what I think are clearly unethical wars and economic policies abroad. In your book, I think you say the exceptionalism is weaponized. You mentioned Russia. I know a few years ago, the Russian President Putin famously wrote a New York Times op-ed complaining about American exceptionalism. But going a little bit further, what amazes me even more is not just from the government level, but the exceptionalism you encounter at the individual level of the U.S. citizen, and not just natural-born U.S. citizens, but immigrants. I've met many people that hold America up on a pedestal to a point where it can do no wrong, and these immigrants end up loving America more than the countries that they come from. And they've even told me that I won't live a better life outside of America, which is false, because I've been living a great life abroad. You can have a great life in America, but also abroad. And I'll admit that there's a lot of good things about America, but there's a lot of bad things that we tend to ignore, such as these wars that America has initiated that have killed millions around the world. Americans don't want to think about that, or the economic plunder of foreign nations. And I think one reason America enjoys a comfortable lifestyle is because we've stolen and extracted resources from countries on the periphery of the empire, just like the Roman Empire did. So, can you tell us, how do you define American exceptionalism, and why is it such an important or critical ideology that serves the empire?
We define American exceptionalism in our book as broadly the ideology that has spanned for the last 2 centuries plus, that's really rooted in the formation of the United States. And this ideology basically presumes that the United States is a force for good in the world, and it takes its cues from the Western liberal ideology and narrative that presumes that the West is the beacon of civilization. The United States, and American exceptionalism, really sees itself as the most advanced form of that ideology, a new form that has been ordained by God to civilize the entire world in its image. And so the reason why this ideology is so important is not only because, as you say, the justification of wars are really based upon this ideology. The justification of some of the most miserable conditions that exist on this earth are justified by the idea that the United States has the right to do this, and that these conditions are actually an improvement upon the world than prior to a U.S. intervention. When we look at American exceptionalism, especially its effects right here in the United States, we see that many individuals, and even people on the far left, even people on the most radical of political persuasions, those who are anti-establishment, they ultimately end up usually reinforcing American exceptionalism in their analysis of issues that go beyond the borders of the United States. So we saw this really starkly after Obama's election, when he really ramped up the war machine of the United States in Libya and the nation of Syria. And few people on the left had any issue with that. Actually, there were some who were cheerleading those wars. There were some who were saying that Gaddafi needed to be overthrown because he was a dictator who was raping his own people. They were saying the same about Bashar al-Assad. And there was very little critical thinking as to what was actually happening there and what was the long-standing U.S. policy in the region. And if we just learned from Iraq, we knew that the United States really doesn't tell the truth when it comes to what it is doing abroad and why it does it. But yet, even many people of the liberal and of the far left decided that it was okay, that because the United States had the right to do these things, and because the United States was the alternative to these so-called brutal, inhuman, subhuman dictators, that it was the right of the United States to intervene in these countries, and we've seen the disasters that this causes. So it's a really important ideology to dissect, because if we don't understand what American exceptionalism is, and who are the purveyors of it, who are the creators, who are the ones who are wielding it in the interest of power, because individuals can wield it and they can believe in it all they want, but really it's about what is the power structure that wields it, and how do they implement it for their own strategic and economic and political purposes.
Well, then why don't you go ahead and tell us your perspective of the power structure that does wield American exceptionalism.
Right, and we talk about it as being rooted in the profit motive, and that the United States is an empire that is rooted in the capitalist economy, which seeks among especially the richest and the most powerful individuals who basically own this economy. They really rely upon war in order to create the conditions necessary to exploit and to control the resources of other nations. And that requires political power, and that requires political control. And so the military, the U.S. military state, is the arm of the U.S. government and the U.S. political economy, which allows corporations and it allows the military-industrial complex to be able to extend its tentacles wherever it desires. One of the huge contradictions of this period, though, and we saw this in Libya in 2011, is that a lot of the wars now that the U.S. wages are wars of chaos, and that they actually don't produce the recognized stability and the needed stability for the United States to actually wield total political and economic control. So the United States has ended up becoming a nation that is controlled by the super rich, but a nation that cannot actually produce conditions that can better or improve the lot of humanity. Actually, all it does is create vast areas of instability and regional catastrophe, which not only hurts in a lot of ways the profits of a lot of major corporations, which is why we see some of the divisions right now happening in the power structure of the United States around issues of foreign policy. But we also see that the narrative of American exceptionalism that is purveyed upon us by official Washington, the Pentagon, and its intelligence agencies, that their justifications are becoming so glaringly exposed as myth. In Libya, we were told that the Libyan state was a state that was a failed state and a dictatorship and ruled by a autocrat. But after the United States and NATO intervened and destroyed that country, what was left of Libya was just a heap of rubble in a completely divided country, not run by any particular political faction in any stable way. And we've seen the chaos, the reports of open slave markets, but also just the inability of the Libyan people to determine their destiny and to be able to build a country and an economy that can function even. So the failed state was really brought upon Libya. And that's what we're facing right now, is a system in decline, a system that's run by powerful individuals who own the means of production in the state. And they are the ones who are creating havoc for the millions, if not billions, of people around the world. And this is ultimately what the book seeks to expose. And we hope that being able to reveal and expose this narrative helps us reflect on how we need to really shed it from our political doctrine and our activities from here on forward.
And let's talk a little bit more about the wars, because I think this is important. And you talk about in your book about some myths, false narratives, as well as fake news. And, you know, I used to teach history in Mexico, and I'm also a Mexican citizen. And I remember, I mean, and this shows just this anecdote, the extent of American exceptionalism that goes beyond the U.S. So I was in Mexico, and I had a Mexican colleague, and he was teaching world history together with me. And in his world history class, he was teaching how the U.S. won World War II, right? And this is a Mexican. This is not a U.S. citizen. This is a Mexican. So this shows the far reach of this, you know, ideology of American exceptionalism. And meanwhile, in my history class, I was teaching that the Russians, you know, defeated the Germans and were based. I mean, that's just the facts. Those are the facts. That the Russians basically, you know, 20, I think you've mentioned 27 million Russians died trying to defeat the Germans. They won the war. It wasn't the Americans. And I think this is also important because, you know, I don't like labels, but, you know, if you're going to label me, you can call me conservative, libertarian sort of person. And I was listening recently to a sermon of a pastor who, you know, they think he's a great guy, but they're misguided in this sense where, you know, this pastor, this was an old sermon, and he was saying that he was praying for Operation Desert Storm, you know, the U.S. invasion of Iraq in the 90s, which again, where most of the wars are based on false notions, right? You know, and this well-meaning American pastors praying for the troops, but I'm thinking, wait a minute. I mean, we shouldn't even be starting this war. We shouldn't be there, and they have this wrong idea. Because of this American exceptionalism, we can't do no wrong. We're going out there to help these people, when in fact we're initiating illegal wars that kill millions of people, and it's not the right thing to do. So I don't know if you want to talk about some of these false narratives and myths in history in World War II or wherever else.
Yeah, let's talk about World War II, because across the political spectrum, and as you say, even globally, the United States has been able to create, and this is a huge part of American exceptionalism, it's this ability of the powers that be in the United States to create a cross-class, I call it, because I believe the U.S. is a class society. But if we just look at the notion of a popular allegiance, a cross-class and a popular allegiance, to these myths is what really makes the ideology so effective and really has objective material consequences for the world, as you say. And so if we look at World War II, for example, and of course, many even mainstream historians, you can go into the Foreign Policy Journal and find pieces, reputable pieces about the Soviet Union's role in World War II and how it was the Soviet Union who fought the bulk of the entire war, not just defeating Nazi Germany, but really creating the conditions where that war was going to be won for the forces of progress and against fascism. That was the Soviet Union and Russia. But if we look at the U.S. role in that war, it often is spoken about as the U.S. saved the world, and that the World War II is the one war, and the New York Times has said this, people like Paul Krugman have said this, that the U.S.'s example in World War II is the one time that the U.S. can really say that it was intervening for the good of humanity or for the common good. But let's look at the reality here. The United States did not intervene in World War II for the common good. The United States waited several years. The war had been fought for over half a decade prior to U.S. entrance, and the U.S. really entered for its own political reasons. It had issues with Japanese encroachment in Southeast Asia. The U.S. was looking at Korea, and it really wanted that region's strategic, military, and economic position. It really wanted control over that. But then we can also look at what the U.S. did during World War II in order to secure some of these interests, because that's what the United States was really all about at that time. It was about securing economic and geopolitical dominance. And the U.S. basically built the largest military-industrial complex ever seen in human history during this time in order to do things like, one, early in the war, finance the biggest industrialists for financing the military and political campaign of Hitler. That's just fact. If we look at some of these industrialists like Henry Ford, that's what they were doing. But then during the formal U.S. entrance into the war, the U.S. was financing the United Kingdom with in the Lend-Lease model with millions upon millions, if not billions of dollars, what would be billions of dollars now worth of military equipment in order to wreak havoc. And we saw this in the firebombing of Dresden, for example, where the United States and the UK collaborated to murder 30,000 people in under a day in Dresden, which historians now across a mainstream political persuasions see as completely unnecessary to the war effort. And why did they do that? Well, the United States and the UK saw the Red Army marching that way and said, we're going to show the Soviet Union, we're going to show Russia what we can do, because we're looking ahead. We're looking ahead at the broader Cold War that was about to be sparked after World War II. And the United States really had an interest in showing its political and economic superiority to the Soviet Union. That was really what the dropping of the atomic bombs was all about. The United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan during a time where Japan was actually having backdoor negotiations to surrender. But the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, said this was necessary for Japan to surrender, when in fact the history shows, the real history shows, that the United States was really interested in showing the Soviet Union that it had nuclear capabilities, which it could utilize very close to the Russian regional strategic area. So this is what we talked about in the book, is that the reality of American exceptionalism, the reality of these myths that are so pervasive, are not only so detached from the actual history and political record of the United States, but also their effect is to create an allegiance to these crimes, that not only do we not see the crimes, but we are convinced that they aren't crimes at all.
Yeah, that's one of the things that gets me are these double standards. You have, I think, 20 or 21 essays or chapters in the book, and you talk about different topics. You talk about human rights, how human rights are weaponized, and all these double standards, like we see now with Iran, where it's the U.S. who pulls out of the deal and then says Iran's the bad guy, or with Russia, where it's the U.S. who's pulling out all of the nuclear arms control treaties and then saying it's Russia's fault. Russia's violating them. And I'm just looking around. It's like, doesn't anyone see this is absolutely absurd, and that the U.S. in these instances is operating undiplomatically and unfairly. And that's what really gets me. And so I don't know if you want to comment on anything there. These double standards, how human rights are being weaponized, humanitarianism or humanitarian intervention, as you mentioned in Libya, as we see, or Venezuela. I interviewed one of my professors who happened to be the UN Special Reporter, Alfred de Zayas, who went to Venezuela, and he talks about how the human rights are being weaponized, and it's the U.S. who's destroying the economy in Venezuela. I mean, sure, if you ask me, I might say maybe Venezuela didn't have the best system, but the U.S. is coming in and doing great damage, is causing the loss of lives in Venezuela. And sometimes people, because of their ideologies, they don't want to see some of these bad things. So, what can you say there?
Yeah, very good points. And, what's striking about your comments too is we can disagree with how Venezuela or any other country organizes itself to economically and politically meet the population's needs. We can always disagree on that. What the United States does is not only disagree on that and oftentimes lie about the systems of other countries, but it also takes extremely hypocritical actions in response to them. So when we think about how the United States treats the world as its backyard, we can see that not only does the United States create conditions where sanctions in Venezuela have killed 40,000 people from 2015 to 2017 alone, we don't even know what the numbers will be now that the sanctions have been tightened. They will likely rise. But we also see that the fact that the United States calls people like Nicolas Maduro a dictator and an autocrat, but then goes and gives hundreds of billions of dollars worth of military equipment over several years to Saudi Arabia, which is an actual monarchy, an actual theocratic regime, an autocracy that is based on a wholly right-wing interpretation of a religion, which nearly half of the world practices and sees as a stain upon humanity. When we look at what Saudi Arabia does to journalists, what it does to women, its horrific human rights record. It's known internationally as the number one sponsor of terrorism, the so-called force in the world that the United States says it's waging a war against. We see the hypocrisy everywhere. But the United States, because it is never held accountable, because it has used its economic and military supremacy, now more military supremacy than economic in this stage of its life, we see that the United States basically protects its hypocrisy under the barrel of a gun. And that is really the critical issue that we have to deal with. Because at the end of the day, nations like Venezuela, Syria, any nation that is being targeted, Iran, for example, can't really determine their own destiny under the barrel of the gun of the United States. And so if we really do truly care about these so-called values that the U.S. says it cares about, liberty, freedom, democracy, then we should hold the United States accountable, but we should also ensure that the United States is not allowed to be hypocritical about its so-called motives abroad. And that really means reining in this war machine, which is creating so much catastrophe and devastation, and not allowing people around the world, even places like China, where economic growth is so high and there's so many advancements, China can't even operate freely in this world economy, in this world system, because the United States is so hell-bent on military encirclement and on ensuring that countries that China really will need to negotiate and work with to advance are totally being held in a state of backwardness, because the United States has no interest in any of that. Its interests mainly are in ensuring that it remains the number one superpower, and it will lie its way and talk about these myths as if they're fact until, there is a force that can challenge it. And I think that we're seeing that now, that these myths, and one of the reasons we wrote this book was not to just convince Americans and convince people here that they need to unlearn some of these things, but it's also to understand that we're in a moment where American exceptionalism is under great challenge, and we need to be part of that challenge. We need to say that the United States should not be the number one superpower in the world, given what it's done to humanity, that we need to build mutual relationships of mutual support and cooperation and solidarity with people around the world in order to really change these conditions, because we shouldn't want hundreds of thousands, millions of migrants being displaced from their countries. We shouldn't want endless wars, and we shouldn't want the poverty and the devastation that all of this creates.
Or a surveillance police state. You mentioned the empire and China. Eurasia is rising. Mackinder's heartland. I actually had the privilege to visit the geographic center of Eurasia recently. And so what are your thoughts going forward? I mean, historically, if we read history, we see empires rise, empires fall. Sometimes they go to war with the rising empire. So, I mean, and we've seen, you mentioned Russia, NATO is surrounding Russia. I mean, they're trying to cut through the heartland to divide Russia and China. I'm in Kazakhstan right now, and we had the transition in power, and there's been some protests and unrest recently. I haven't had time to write an article about this, but I wrote my thesis, a graduate thesis on color revolutions. And when you talk to often many liberals who believe in this American exceptionalism, some Western reporters that I've met in Kazakhstan, when you talk about color revolution, they say, "Oh, that's a Russian conspiracy theory." It's like, wait a minute, there's facts. I can show you this. And I was shocked to discover that this movement of unrest in Kazakhstan recently, one of the leaders was trained by the National Endowment for Democracy, which was, basically it's an NGO set up by the CIA to overthrow foreign governments. So, and so it looks like, the U.S. is in there between Russia and China and Kazakhstan, stirring up unrest. And Hong Kong, we see what's happening now, Venezuela, Iran. And so it seems like the empire is going mad. And so what are your thoughts in the future? Do you think we're going to see, they're talking about using low-yield nuclear weapons, tactical mini nukes. I mean, this is kind of crazy, but I mean, do you see war or do you see, a peaceful transition to the East rising? What are your thoughts there?
A lot of it will depend on what people in the United States will do and what people in the Western world will do, because I think that China and Russia truly do want a peaceful transition. I think the leadership in both of those countries understand that they are honestly the future of the world system at this time, the world economic and political system at this time. China's abundant economic growth and Russia's military strength and its recovery from the disastrous Yeltsin period that the U.S. backed so heavily. Its recovery has given China a deep economic and military and strategic partnership, which really is carrying the world towards the East. We see this with the One Belt, One Road initiative, and just the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of economic activity that China and Russia plan to do in the near future. So we know that they are looking for a peaceful transition, that they are offering a model that is different from the unipolar superpower model based in American exceptionalism that the United States wields currently. However, the United States doesn't want that. We see all of its foreign policy and domestic policy prerogatives are all based upon ensuring that no alternative to its system is allowed to emerge. That the United States talks about democracy all the time, but it won't allow its own people to demand things like Medicare for all and actually have them seen through, or to demand things like a massive reduction in the prison population and have those things seen through. We see that the United States' powerful elite do not want that, and that all of their foreign policy measures right now, whether it's through saber rattling with Venezuela, ratcheting of sanctions with Cuba, the same against Iran, and the continued military occupation of Syria, all of this shows that the United States is really pointing its guns, it's pointing all of its energies and military military capacities toward Russia and China. That is what the Trump administration announced in its national security policy document, saying that Russia and China are the strategic enemies of the United States. They are the main competitors. We're not fighting terrorism anymore. We're fighting the progress that Russia and China is laying out, because Russia and China are going to replace economically and militarily U.S. One superpower supremacy. And so how I see things happening is that if the people of the United States and the Western world are able to rise up and say no to the potential for nuclear war, and there could be a possibility that the United States will be restrained and its partners will be restrained. But we also know that the United States just doesn't control even its own allies anymore, if it ever really did. So we know that Israel and Saudi Arabia and some of these players do have a huge sway on what the United States does. And so it's going to be a very complicated process. But unfortunately, I do see a high potential of a dangerous nuclear confrontation right around the corner. And so I hope that this book can really outline what people really need to know about how the United States talks about itself in order to shed that belief amongst ourselves, so we can demand from our own government that we do not want such a nuclear catastrophe to take place, because we do care about humanity and we do care about development that is about progress, and it is about meeting the needs that we have that are so pressing here and around the world. And I think that there are more people. We have history on our side, and we have the people on our side, but they do have control over the the commanding heights of the economy and the state. And so unless that changes in some way, unless that is challenged, yes, we are in for a really difficult situation to come. And I think the Trump era, this era where we see all of these divisions happening, and Trump himself, even though he's a very ranchivist and arch racist type individual, we see even when he does something that we should all support, talking to the DPRK, wanting relations with Russia that are not based on ever increasing aggression, he is attacked by the ruling elite in this country. So we have to, and in the Western world generally, so we have to really see these developments for what they are, as a product of a very dangerous path that the United States is walking toward. And hopefully, as more people begin to unlearn that, with the help of my book and the help of your work, that we can prepare ourselves to unite around this very dangerous moment, so we can have peace, real peace on this planet.
Is there any other key point that you want to get across from your book? Because there's a lot of topics there. Anything else that I haven't asked?
Sure. I'll just say that, we take a position that American exceptionalism and American innocence too, because we talk a lot about American innocence, which is the idea that the United States, even when it is criticized correctly for the crimes that it commits, that those crimes are justified based upon its intentions and its ultimate goals. We're pure and we're right, and we're all about making the world a better place. That this ideology is also dangerous, and it's very related to the notion of American exceptionalism. So there's that, and there's also the point that we take a position that American exceptionalism is a ideology based in white superiority, and that if we look at the links between the way that the United States behaves around the world and creates these images of inhumanity and subhuman depictions of who people are around the world, whether it's Syrian people or the Iranian people, whether it's from Vietnam, part Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese people, I still hold a lot of the things that I heard growing up in this country dear, because it was indicative of the notion that U.S. superiority is really based on the notion that whites are superior, Westerners are superior to everyone else, and that those who are not Westerners or white Americans were ultimately dispensable. They were ultimately disposable and could be destroyed at any moment for whatever the United States wanted to accomplish. So, in effect, we're looking at not only an ideology that's a lie, but one that has always been based upon mass extinction. And I think that logic has taken us to this very dangerous moment where now Russians and people in China, the People's Republic, are seen as these boogeymen that are not worth learning or listening to, understanding. And it's that idea of superiority, that very inculcated and deeply embedded superiority that a lot of Americans feel is what is going to do a lot of harm and has done a lot of harm over the course of history.
Yeah, I mean, just to comment on the white supremacists, I was reading your book. I mean, again, from my perspective, I just kind of take it down to human nature. Or if you go back into history, you might see other empires that, the Mongol empires or the Turkish Ottoman Empire, where there were groups or an empire of power that wasn't white that subjugated others. And, perhaps, from your perspective, in the current age that we live in, there's a higher number of whites that are in power. So I might differ with you there a little bit, but I would also add that this is a good example of us now talking. We have a different perspective, and we agree on some things. And I would also call out our other fellow Americans. I get attacked a lot from people from my own side when we should have a self-examination more, look at things more critically, and not just blindly attack people, and have a healthy factual examination of this exceptionalism that is doing a lot of damage around the world, and not just blindly following our leaders or even some of the people that we elected. You mentioned Obama. There are people that were voted for Obama and they were disillusioned. There's people I know that voted for Trump, and instead of looking at some of the bad things that he does, like he can do no wrong, and it's just like, come on, let's be fair here. So, any final comment from you?
Sure. Well, I really appreciate you having me on, and I believe that the more that we're able to have these discussions about history and ultimately about the very structure, the social structure, the political and economic structure that undergirds all of the myth making that the United States is involved in American exceptionalism and American innocence, and there's a whole host more, that we can really begin to create a change of political consciousness, which is so necessary in the United States, especially. I mean, the United States is probably the most warped country when it comes to just political consciousness and understanding, to be able to make informed decisions politically based upon an examination of the material reality that we live in. The United States is way far behind the Western world, and not so far behind it, but much of the world is looking at the United States and looking at the people of the United States and waiting and wondering, when is that upheaval? When is that change? When is that spark going to happen where we can not only build spaces to have this understanding, because honestly, universities in this country, workplaces, schools, they are hostile, right? We have this huge surveillance state, this police state in the United States, which is, one of the strongest and most draconian that exists in the world. And there isn't a lot of room. So independent journalists, independent activists, people who are saying these things, who want to get this message out, have a really hard time doing that. So, for your viewers and, anyone else who may come across this, it's really important that we support each other and that we begin to build these relationships. And, we can have these internal discussions, we can have these discussions of disagreement, but we should be looking towards ways to build unity, and a real global unity that can really begin to build a vision for what's to come, a different vision from what the United States' official Washington and military industrial complex sees for the world, and what the Western imperial apparatus sees for the world, and being to formulate one that is more akin to what the vast majority of humanity wants, which is really peace and justice.
All right, and where can people best follow you in your work?
Right, so you can find me at blackagendareport.com. I write a weekly column there under the name Danny Haiphong. You can also find me on the American Herald Tribune. I've written plenty for that source, and it's been very generous and kind, and it's a very good independent source as well. And you can find my book, Skyhorse Publishing website. You can also find me on Twitter at Spirit of Ho, one word, Spirit of Ho. And you can also find me on Facebook at Danny Haiphong. So, please reach out to me and, let's build.
Yeah, I would definitely check out the book. I just finished reading it, so people can go check that out. If you can't get the physical copy, you can purchase the electronic version. And as well, people can find, you give a lot of interviews, so if they just put your name into YouTube, they'll find that. And again, thanks for your time and for the interview.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast and interview. I would like to remind you that our website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and you can sign up for our mailing list that goes out each weekend with the latest podcast and a long collection of important news headlines. It's good to sign up for the newsletter in case we experience censorship and deplatforming. You can help the Geopolitics and Empire podcast by subscribing to and interacting with all of our channels such as YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Gab, Minds, and Steemit. You can also help us by leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platforms such as iTunes, Castbox, Stitcher, Spreaker, and so on. Finally, if you value our work and our mission and would like to see us continue interviewing experts from across the political spectrum, please consider leaving a one-time donation via PayPal or Bitcoin or becoming a regular monthly supporter on our Patreon. All the links can be found on geopoliticsandempire.com. Thanks for listening.